But the second factor that is actually more important and happened at the same time is China industrialized and urbanized. When you live on the farm, kids are free labor. You have a lot of them. They're an economic asset. When you move into the town, they're just an expense. You have fewer of them. Well, over 40 years, China went from being roughly 80% urban, 80% rural to 80% urban. And so the birth rate dropped by 75% just from that. One-child policies on top of that. Their birth rate dropped below population replacement levels, probably around 1985 to 1990. Today, in the major cities, it's less than 0.4.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Hope you're ready for another episode of Change Agents, an IRONCLAD original presented by Firecracker Farm. Now, let's dive in. Okay. How many people in the U.S. do you think could find Taiwan on a map inside of
It's, we're a lot better at that than we were 20 years ago, so I'm going to go with 1 in 4.
Man. Well, yeah, they could find it. Honestly, I think we have to start broad and work our way narrow. So can you paint for me the current picture, Taiwan and its importance? Because I think most people understand, obviously we're in a global economy, but we got U.S., China, there's some interesting things going on. I know we're going to talk about
2 or 3, yeah.
Yeah. But Taiwan sits, I'm not going to say necessarily in between the two, but metaphorically in between those two countries. So I think we'd probably be best if you can paint with the broad strokes, just the situation as it is. And maybe, I don't know how it's changed, maybe the most massive changes or the most important changes you've seen in maybe the last decade or two.
Sure. Let me give you 3 things. And honestly, in the last 10 years, nothing's changed. Nothing.
Perfect.
Yeah. Number 1, Taiwan is democracy. China is probably the purest example of absolute fascism that the human race has ever experienced. So there's that. Number 2 is the strategic issue. Taiwan is part of what we like to call the first island chain, which was a series of islands from Japan to Taiwan to the Philippines to Indonesia that basically roughly parallel the Chinese coast. And as long as those countries are independent, China has 0 chances of being a strategic power, much less a global one, unless it has some sort of external security guarantor that allows its shipping to go to and from, and that is the United States. So there is no version of a China that matters in the long run without American active involvement. And then third, there's the tech side, which is not nearly as dirty as a lot of people think it is. Yes, Taiwan is where all of the pieces for the semiconductor supply chain come together, but not a lot of the value added is there. So if China were to disappear tomorrow, would we still have high-end chips? No, but it would be the same thing if Canada disappeared, or Morocco disappeared, or Germany disappeared. There are over 30,000 pieces that come together to make semiconductors happen, and they come together in Taiwan, but we still need all the pieces.
Yeah. How did you develop an interest in this area of the world? I mean, you're world-renowned in your expertise here. And of all the things in the world that you could study, I'm always fascinated by how people find their niche.
Well, I'm a generalist. I do a little bit. Well, no, that's not true. I do a lot of everything. It keeps me into a lot of trouble in a lot of places. But for the East Asian Rim specifically, it's just there's certain parts of the global economy in its current shape where there's more of an emphasis on one region versus another. So when you think about energy, it's the United States, it's the former Soviet Union, it's the Middle East. When you think of agriculture, it's the United States, it's Brazil, it's the former Soviet Union, it's Northern Europe, it's Australia. And when you think of manufacturing, especially if it's manufacturing for products that require current, it's all Northeast Asia. And it's not just China. China is the assembly point, but the high-end tech is Japan and Korea and Taiwan. You have the middlemen in places like Malaysia and Thailand. It's a place where for the modern world, as we choose to define it, all of this work is done. And there's nothing that says it can't be done elsewhere. But if you want it to be done elsewhere, you have to put the effort in and build out several tens of trillions of dollars of manufacturing capacity, and you don't do that in one presidential campaign.
Just going to ask you about that. It's I'm not an expert in geopolitics. I'm not an expert in tariffs. I'm not an expert in the economy. I try to listen to people when they talk. I go with the assumption that they're telling me how they feel and what they want to do. I hear Trump saying, we're going to bring manufacturing back to the US. And I'm sitting here and I know people in the manufacturing world. And when they tell me it would take 5 years minimum, realistically 10 years to bring these things back, I worry about the velocity that he seems not, I don't want to say it's a pipe dream, but he is perhaps
I
promising,
think pipe
though.
dream is overly optimistic.
Well, it's, he's trying to throw all these particular levers. What are your thoughts on, I guess, two-pronged question? One, that desire to bring the manufacturing back, but two, what is the realistic timeline that you think people should be viewing this through?
Well, again, three things. Number one, figure out what we want. So right now, the United States is the most technologically advanced services economy in the world. We have outsourced most of the manufacturing to worker sets that are more appropriate. If we were to try to do most manufacturing in the United States today, the cost would be so much higher because that's not what our skill set is. That's not what we've trained for. That's not what we've built our infrastructure for. So the big story in the United States right now, if you can put the global stuff aside for a moment, it's data centers, high value added because of software, and that makes American workers the most productive on the planet. That is not the workforce or the infrastructure that you need if you want to, say, manufacture a computer, especially at the assembly stage. That is significantly further down the system. So we do the high-end purification for the inputs. We do the design. We do the very, very high value-added components. And then those three steps are taken somewhere else where the lower manufacturing quality is done. So great example, think about automobiles. The most sophisticated part of the automobiles today are the transmission and the computing components. And we do some of that. Some of the lower end stuff is, say, the engine block. Mexico does that. Americans can make the engine block, but for every person we put on making the engine block, that's one fewer person that can do the transmission. And if you apply that for the million or so different product codes that we have, if we want to do it all at home ourselves, we'll have a Mao economy. And we would see economic growth plummet once we got the growth spurt out of the way from actually building the infrastructure, because we're just not value added in that way. We need partners to do those steps. So that's kind of collectively piece one. Piece two, let's say we decide we still want to go down that road, that we still want to reduce the American economy in terms of value added and reduce our standard of living in order to achieve a degree of security. That's a choice we could make if we wanted to. If that is the goal, we need to expand the American industrial plant bare minimum by about $40 trillion. That's just to take the stuff that comes from the East Asian Rim today if we want to build it here. If you want to go 100% autarkic and make everything produced here, you're now talking probably about something closer to $100 trillion of capital investment. That requires a degree of not just government leadership that we are usually not comfortable with, but a degree of reliability in the regulatory structure and the governing structure and the tax structure that the Trump administration has not even expressed an interest in exploring. So today, we got our 133rd change in tariff policies of this administration. No one knows what the rules are going to be tomorrow, much less next year, much less 10 years from now. And it takes time for this stuff to take effect. So we've seen industrial construction spending flatline for the entirety of the Trump administration because no one knows what the rules of the game are. And if you're going to make an investment of something that from an economic point of view seems unwise, unless you're sure that the rules are going to hold for a decade, why would you make that investment in the first place? What was the third thing?
I think that was the third thing.
Let's see. Third thing.
Well, interestingly, you're the first person that I've heard, or maybe I'm not paying attention enough. I mean, we're so bombarded with information. It's hard to, separate the wheat from the chaff. And people think that their algorithms are flawed, but the reality is you just get shown more of what you engage with. So maybe you have a hand in your own algorithm. So I like to see bike crashes and people not looking both ways when they cross the street. I don't know what that says about me, not germane to the conversation, but it's the first I've heard, the conversation that I am hearing externally, specifically from those aligned with the Trump administration. And maybe I'm paraphrasing this incorrectly. But for the future and security of our country, we have to stop relying on other countries. We need to bring jobs here and security. But I've never once heard them say we'd have to reduce our quality of life to trade in a potentially Faustian bargain for an increase in that security.
You just reminded me of the third thing. So if we bring these things back, we go one of two directions. Option one, we produce them the same way that they're produced in East Asia right now. Bangladeshis at sewing machines, sewing underwear. You will not be earning the average American income of $75,000 a year if that is your job. No. Or we completely redesign how the manufacturing process happens, in which case those sets of underwear are automated in some way with technology that we have yet to invent. Now we're talking about an industrial build-out that looks different from anything that has come before. And to think we'll get that on the first try? No. To think that that is going to lead to a broad spectrum economic equality across the United States because everyone now has a better job? No. It means we have an inequality issue that mimics here what currently exists between the American worker and the Bangladeshi worker. These are, I don't want to say dystopian outcomes, but they require a degree of economic experimentation on the societal level that the United States has never done. I mean, this is Maoist. This is Hitlerian. These are not things that you implement without a massive overhaul of what society is.
That is never part of the conversation that I'm hearing, or I should say at least the external broadcasting of the stated aims and goals of the administration. Any administration, the current administration, previous. And like I said before, you're the only person I've heard mention that decrease in quality of life for a trade-off in some additional security. I don't know how that plays out.
Well, we've never tried it before in the United States. So for us, if you want to take the statistician's approach, n equals 0. We don't have a lot to work from. But this is exactly what you do if you're trying to do an overall overhaul of the economic structure. And we do have a few examples in the past to look at. The transformation of Japan after or before World War I, the transformation of Korea after World War II and the Korean War. It's not always a negative story, but in all of these other places where this has happened, very, very rapid industrialization, very, very rapid technological change, they started from an almost pre-industrial level. And so when you add electricity and concrete and railroads and steel and all the rest, obviously the quality of life goes up. What we're talking about now is going the other direction, moving away from silicon, moving away from data, moving away from services and into textiles and into steel. It's a very different process.
Yeah. I didn't realize there had been 133 as of today changes in the tariff policy.
Yeah, it's been busy.
Again, that obviously has impacts on the global economy. If you were to hypothesize, I don't have any data to show me that they're going to reduce the number of changes and variables that they're going to be introducing. How do you...
Donald Trump has definitely indicated, if anything, he's going the other direction. He already has at least another 24 tariff plans locked and loaded.
So what does that look like for, I guess, two things, the global economy, but then also how the rest of the world kind of views our leadership and our place in that global economy?
That's a thorny topic. At the moment, the United States has abdicated its leadership role in everything, much to our detriment, I would argue. We've withdrawn from things like the World Health Organization, so we're not even getting the information about outbreaks around the world, and we won't until they hit the country. So, that's going to kill a lot of people. In terms of NATO, we hold a position that's called the Supreme Commander. The Trump administration is setting into motion to withdraw from that. What that means is Supreme Commander role means that in case of war, we basically take control of all of the allied militaries directly and double the size of our military capability. That's now gone. And that's before you consider the implications of things like the Ukraine war and the Russia resurgence and the Chinese build out and all those things. So from the allies' point of view, we are no longer an ally, and they are reluctantly deciding that they have to take matters into their own hands. And for people who think that the allies haven't been carrying the weight, that's fine. But if they start making security decisions, not with us, but despite us, they start acting like normal countries again. And the last time that Germany and Japan acted like normal countries, shit got real fast. And we're setting up the perfect situation for a global conflagration. Whether or not we participate in it, there's a lot of steps between here and there. I don't know, but I don't feel great about it. In terms of the
Yeah.
economic structure, it's a lot messier. We've spent 75 years building out global infrastructure and global manufacturing capacity in its current form. And I would argue, to give Trump his due here, that this was always going to be temporary. It was always going to break. I think China's the single most vulnerable piece of that because of their demographic structure. They've had a lower birth rate than we have now for 30, 35 years. And in the next 10 years, they simply are going to run out of people under age 55 to do the work in the first place. So we needed to prepare for a post-China world anyway. The problem was timing. You don't add $40 trillion of industrial infrastructure overnight. And especially when you've gotten out of the low value added things like, say, processing, aluminum, steel, lithium, cobalt, copper, all the rest, you have to build that first. What Trump has done is tariff that first. So we don't even have easy access to the materials that we need to start the industrial expansion that we need to prepare for the end of China. And Trump has done something that I think is the most irresponsible. He's robbed us of the time to do it. So we're looking at a lot slower growth, at a lot more pain with a lot more inflation to do something that honestly we had to do anyway.
Yeah, I agree in concept with, I want every administration to be successful, for clarity.
That would be nice, yes.
Well, people lose their fucking minds, right? Like, oh my God, you're on the left or the right. I'm like, guys, my mind is all over the place. Sometimes it's on the left, sometimes it's on the right. Sometimes I have one foot on both sides of the aisle, if you can believe that. It's okay. Life can be more than just binary. And, Doge is a good example. I love the idea of scrutiny on government spending, but let's use a scalpel instead of a broadsword and be precise about what we're doing as opposed to spigot shutting things off that might have cascading consequences we don't understand. I like the idea of increasing security for the United States and, it maybe settling a little out of the inadequacies in the trade, global trade. But holy shit, like you said, if you don't give us the time to do that, our manufacturers the time to do that, I feel like we're creating and then swallowing our own poison pill here.
Yeah, you don't have to convince me. One of the problems we have with this administration is that, I think it's best to compare Trump to the president he's most similar to, and that's Obama. Both of them are convinced of the smartest person in any room, which, from my understanding, is not exactly an oddity among presidents. But Obama was so confident in his arrogance that he didn't feel that he needed anyone to tell him. So he just basically shut the White House off from the world for 8 years, and we didn't have policy because that would require a conversation with someone who was his lesser. Trump feels the need for the validation. And what he discovered in his first term is if you want to be a good president, you have to take advice and information from people who know things about topics in greater depth than you do. A good president is a manager. And so what he discovered is every time somebody came in from the outside world or elsewhere in the government, especially in things like foreign affairs, he didn't feel like the smartest person in the room. And so he fired them all. He went through more cabinet secretaries than any other 3 presidents we've had. And he was only there, in his first term for 4 years. Mm-hmm. How he dealt with that in his time out of power was to purge the Republican Party of all the policy experts. So he would never have that feeling again. And when he came in the second time, he didn't bring in a squad that knew how the world worked. He brought in loyalists. And this first thing he did on his first week was fire everyone he could in the federal government, the top 1,600 jobs down, and very few of them have been replaced. So there's no information percolating up in the White House about what's actually happening in the world. And when something does finally squeeze through, like say this intelligence assessment that was done on Venezuela that says that the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan gangs actually hate each other. So the government is not sending the gangs to the United States, really wild concept. Mm-hmm. The Trump administration sent the report back to be rewritten to match the rhetoric. You usually only see this sort of breakdown in decision-making and information flow in a totalitarian system that's on the verge of collapse, which I might add is where China is these days.
I've heard you speak before about the age demographic in China and some of your other content. So this can be standalone and we don't have to launch people off to understand the importance of that. Can you talk about the birth rate, where the U.S. and actually a lot of countries in the world are at, and the consequences that has as the calendar years keep flipping over.
Well, comparing the United States to China is a great way to do that. So let's start with the Chinese. Two things. Number one, the one-child policy. Everybody's heard about that. People were penalized from having more than one kid for 30, 40 years. Obviously, that reduces the birth rate. But the second factor that is actually more important and happened at the same time is China industrialized and urbanized. When you live on the farm, kids are free labor. You have a lot of them. They're an economic asset. When you move into the town, they're just an expense. You have fewer of them. Well, over 40 years, China went from being roughly 80% urban, 80% rural to 80% urban. And so the birth rate dropped by 75% just from that. One-child policies on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
So their population replacement, let me rephrase that, their birth rate dropped below population replacement levels, probably around 1985 to 1990.
Which is what, 2.11 or something like that?
2.1 is the general sale. So today in the major cities, it's less than 0.4. But the point is it dropped below replacement almost 40 years ago, which means they're now running out of people under age 40. So there's no longer enough people in China of a specific age group to even theoretically regenerate the population. We already have more people over age 53 than under 53. And by the end of this decade, and certainly no later than midway through the next decade, it's just over. China as a country, the Han as an ethnicity, are literally vanishing from this world. And it's just a question of how we manage that decline at this point. Now, in the United States, we never had a one-child policy. And the United States has significantly more arable land per person than almost any country in the world, with the exception of like Canada and Australia. So when we urbanized, we didn't go from the farm to the city. We went from farm to small town to suburb to city. So our birth rate has dropped at a significantly lower level than anyone else in the world, even before you consider things like immigration. Mm-hmm. So if we keep aging at our current rate, we won't be in a Chinese style problem this century. And then, of course, everyone else kind of stacks up somewhere in between. So for the Chinese, they need to come up with a new social, political, cultural model that is not based on population growth or consumption or investment or military power or financial strength or trade, because they will be able to do none of those things. We have a lot of time to figure out whatever's next. And it's entirely possible that over the course of the next 70 years, we figure out how to keep our birth rate higher. Because today, it's at the lowest it's ever been. It's still more than triple China's.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're looking for something really unique and special for this Father's Day, listen up. I want to tell you about Firecracker Farm hot salt. This is not just your run-of-the-mill salt. It's pure sea salt infused with Carolina Reaper, scorpion, and ghost peppers. Don't worry, it's not just about the heat. It's also about the flavor. And this stuff adds an invigorating lift to everything you are cooking, from eggs in the morning to your grilled steak at night. It comes in a super satisfying stainless steel push grinder. Here's one of them right here. Easy to travel with, easy to keep right on your shelf. And it lasts over 500 presses per grinder, with most sets including a refill. And because it dispenses such a tiny amount, it brings a ton of flavor without overpowering your food and loading it up with sodium. This is all made in small batches by Alex and his family, a real labor of love. It looks great on the table, it's portable, and trust me, everything is better with hot salt. So if you're hunting for a Father's Day gift that isn't socks or tools, go now to firecracker.farm and use the code IRONCLAD for a discount. I promise you that you will not regret it. That is firecracker.farm. Enjoy. You know, I have 3 children. I'm getting ready to go through birthday season starting tomorrow. My daughter turns 17, and then my son turns 20, and then my oldest is 22. I have no idea how we arrived at this place. I consider it a victory that they're alive. I mean, when they're with me, I'll say that they're gonna live. Their life may not be enriched. You know, I'm doing the best that I can as the dad. They don't listen to me either. But talking with them, it is. I remember talking with my parents when I was about their age, and we talked about family and the idea of the nuclear family, to use a recognizable term, husband, wife. I think honestly it was phrased around 2 children as well. Pretty common. My children, my oldest, 22, does not want to have kids. My middle son, getting ready to turn 20, on the fence about it. My daughter, not interested. And I don't know where this came from.
I can give you two things, one bad, one good. First, the bad. Social media glamorizes or demonizes everything. And so it's just a question of what is on your feed in front of you every given day. And if you see
Families are
Instagram,
not what's on their feet. Let me just tell you, having
yeah,
surfed a little bit of it, yeah, it is the opposite. Yeah, that does not lead their social media feeds for sure.
fair enough. Yeah, it's saying that travel, seeing new places, and it's one of the things the millennials left us was this idea that it's okay to take your 20s off. And that's not accurate for all millennials by any stretch of the imagination, but it has had an indelible impact on the American psyche. On the other side, again, the millennials, they're doing the same thing that every generation before them has ever done. They're having kids, they're buying homes, they're getting married in that order with a 6-year delay.
Hmm.
So as you grow up, priorities change. We're not all Mormon. We're not all going to be having our second kid when we're 23. Maybe that'll be at 29.
Yeah. Okay. Back to Taiwan. God, I could go so many different directions with this, but it's like they want me to talk about Taiwan. We'll talk about Taiwan. Fine. Okay. How does China view Taiwan? Where's the relationship there?
All right. About 90% of the Chinese population, the Han population, lives within about 1,000 miles of the coast, with honestly probably 80% of that within only a couple hundred miles. So it's a very, very dense footprint. As you move west in China, the territory becomes less quality, a lot drier, much more erratic with rainfall, and eventually you hit things like the Tarim Basin that are just a wide open space. And throughout the 3,000 years of the history of the Han ethnicity, they've never been able to really project power west reliably. But every once in a while, somebody comes in and knocks them over, whether it's the Mongols or the Russians, or coming in from the coast, the Portuguese, the Brits, whoever happens to be. China has never held together well. And so the obsession that Beijing has always had is one China, the idea that all the Han are on the same side, marching in lockstep under the same government, and anyone they come across must be subjugated to that will. And so when they look at Taiwan, they see the closest landmass to the coast that dares to be Han and not under Beijing's control. They see it as an obsessive issue of national security. And if you look back at Chinese history, it's not ridiculous. The Han have only actually ruled China in a unified form for about 150 of the last 3,000 years. Half of that is in the period that we're in right now. And so from their point of view, anytime that Taiwan, Taipei has any allegiance other than to Beijing specifically, it's a threat. But so is Hong Kong, and so is Shanghai, and so are the Uyghurs, and so are the Tibetans. So are everyone. This is just how China sees, the Han Chinese see the world, and Taiwan is just in the unfortunate position right now of being the biggest chunk of that territory that doesn't have a Chinese flag on it.
So I have, for the majority of my life, heard about tensions between China and Taiwan. And honestly, and a lot of this, I think, is just conflagration of, if it bleeds, it leads on traditional media. This year is going to be the year. This is the year that it's going to be a forceful. They're going to go and take Taiwan. What do you think? I was going to ask you, do you see a world where that's possible? I think that's obviously possible. Do you see a world where that's actually likely, where they take military action? And I ask that through the lens of there's going to be an international response to that. And I'm curious how you think that international response would just kind of flavor relations with China, if that would lead to a full-scale World War III.
If it's going to happen, it will happen under Trump, because most international leaders view Trump as the weakest president we've ever had. There is very little American projection power capability without the allies. And the Trump administration is basically burning all of those bridges. So we would have a hard time defending Taiwan without active help from Australia and Japan and the rest. That doesn't mean I think it's going to happen. One of the things that was understood very, very deeply in China, at least no more than 6 years ago, was that if there was a conflict in Taiwan, and even if the US didn't get directly involved, and even if Taiwan folded like a sack of like a wet paper bag. And even if China was able to conquer the place completely intact, it doesn't solve any of their problems. You have countries that would do unofficial embargoes 2,000 miles from the coast, and China is the country that needs freedom of the seas the most of any country in human history. They'd face an economic collapse in under 6 months as they can't send product out, couldn't bring energy and food in. You'd see a disassociation of the Chinese system within a year that would kill half the population from famine. The Chinese knew this, but 6 years ago is when Chairman Xi got the last of the advisors that would tell him the truth. And 6 years is a long time to suck down propaganda. So I don't know where his head is these days, but there's no version of a Taiwan war where China survives. So part of me really wants to see it. Personally, I'd rather take the slower approach to Chinese dissolution. We have a lot of work to do between now and then, but sometimes a little drama is fun.
Yeah. Well, given their population decline and where it's heading in a decade, what does that have to say about the current state of their military? What would you put their readiness level at?
That's a great question. We really don't know because the Chinese haven't been in a hot war since Korea, and the military they have now is so radically different. They've spent the money, they've stolen the technology from the Russians, they've built it out, but we really have no idea how well it would work if they actually gave the go order. And part of the problem is that Chairman Xi has basically purged the entire system of anyone with an opinion, starting with local governments, then regional governments, the bureaucracy, media, business, everything. And to think that he's wrecked all of these different sectors of society to the point that they can barely function, but the military is the one thing that works by Western norms, that's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. If they were to take Taiwan, in this hypothetical world, what would be the cascading effect to the U.S.?
Well, step one, we lose all semiconductors on a global basis that are better than about 7 or 8 nanometers. Like I said, Taiwan's where it all comes together. And the only way we would then still have the chips is if everyone in the world agreed, oh, okay, we'll just scratch off Taiwan on the delivery address and stencil in China. All it takes is a few pieces saying no, and none of it works anymore. So I'm all for diversifying the semiconductor supply chain system out of Taiwan, but it's just because the whole system is concentrated absolutely everywhere and all these essential steps.
Yeah.
We would have to actively subsidize the Chinese occupation of Taiwan if we still wanted the chips. I don't think that's going to happen.
How did Taiwan become such a powerhouse in the semiconductor world? Was it
They spent $500 billion building the fabs that no one else would build.
That's probably a good way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bet. It was definitely a bet. It was a risk. They were lucky it worked out. But the very short version is 10, 15 years ago, we were getting to the best capability of what we could do with a technology called deep ultraviolet, which is how we used to make all of our chips. And then ASML, that's the Dutch company that does the lithography. They came up with a new technology called extreme ultraviolet. And most fab facilities in the world looked at these bus-sized lithography machines that cost $500 million each. You're like, I don't know about that. TSMC, the Taiwanese government, decided to spend the money and try, not having no guarantee whether it would work. And it worked. And so they leapfrogged the technology with something that basically, this is an oversimplification, it's digital versus analog. So with the old DUV systems, you'd have to adjust every single machine by hand for every single chip design. And so you'd have a bigger loss rate for the final chips per disk. You would have fewer chips per disk, and no two machines would make the same exact type. So when you started to take those resulting semiconductors and putting in things like computers and motherboards and all the rest, you'd have a much higher loss rate as well. With EUV, basically you type in your specs and every machine just goes ding, 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 and it's all set. And so higher hit rates, lower loss rates, better applications on the backside. And on top of that, you can make smaller and smaller and smaller transistors going down to today's limit, which is about 2.5 nanometers. So it's worked out for them, but there was no guarantee that bet was going to work.
Yeah, they certainly pushed their chips into the right location.
Yeah, Red 17.
Yeah, the roulette ball. It's like we'll take black 16, assuming that it is black. It could be green. Who knows?
Yeah,
But
but I mean that's part of the problem I have when you say you want to bring semiconductors back. Is like what with yesterday's technology, with today's technology, with you want to try for tomorrow's technology. I mean, there's so many moving pieces here. If you
yeah.
get one of them wrong, you're not Taiwan.
Well, and again, I'm not an expert in computing either, but I would say the vernacular of the day is AI, right? This explosion in AI, this
Don't get
AI
used
race.
to it.
Isn't that all underpinned with this technology and these chips coming out of Taiwan anyway?
Every chip that does AI well is 5 nanometers or smaller. And so at the moment, that is 100% Taiwan. But remember, 30,000 steps. It's
Yeah.
this is not going to last deglobalization. It doesn't take the loss of Taiwan. It takes the loss of one company in California or one company in Germany. And we just can't make these chips at all. The most likely outcome of where we're going to be a few years from now is we're not going to be able to do extreme ultraviolet, because it's nice to say it comes from ASML, but the supply chain to make ASML's EUV systems is actually more sophisticated than what it takes to make a chip on the back end. So the idea that this is going to hold as the world cracks, no. So we're going to have to go back to that DUV technology, and we're probably looking at something like 14 or 16 nanometers being the most advanced chips we can make. If you take those chips and use them to, say, apply to ChatGPT 4.0, which is the most advanced thing we have today,
Mhm.
you're going to need 5 times as many chips that use 4 times as many power, 4 times as much power. So you have a 95% loss in efficiency just to be where we are right now. AI in the future, we have to rebuild this entire supply chain. That will take 20 years.
I think I'm okay with AI slowing down a little bit. I don't know how far we are from working for robots for our daily water ration.
We've got some time, but I hope you don't like the iPhone, because that'll be
Oh,
one of
I
the first
know.
products to go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I just call it my anxiety rectangle. Um, it's convenient. We all have one, but yeah, you want to talk about a constant source of anxiety that people forget that they have to opt into actually getting that anxiety and dopamine hit.
Yeah, keep in mind, it's not just the processing chip. One of the big things about this that's really, truly revolutionary is the chips that allow the batteries to do what they do.
Mm.
So if we go back to 14 nanometer chips, your phone is going to be like a 1990s brick with an antenna.
Yeah, I don't think people are ready.
But no,
They're not. Yeah, they're not ready for that. Well, I don't know if I'm going to be sleeping for the next few days.
you're welcome.
What keeps you up the most at night when you have, existential concerns globally? What is it though that keeps you staring at the ceiling fan at night?
I've got two things. The first one, of course, is related to the Trump administration. If you dial back to last October, I would argue that we weren't moving fast enough. And in many cases, the Biden administration was putting their chips in the wrong slots for the bets that they were making, but they were still building the physical infrastructure and the industrial plant that we were going to need. We had seen basically a tripling of industrial construction spending, increased by a factor of 10 in the sectors that really mattered. And even if they got every single specific call wrong, it was still being built. And I was feeling better and better about getting ready for the end of globalization and the end of China. That's basically stopped. And now everything's stalled, and the time frame has been brought forward, because the idea that you break down trade between the world's two largest countries and the one that is export dependent doesn't suffer because of that. Yeah, we don't have as much time anymore before the Chinese are gone, and we've stopped getting ready. That's a problem. That's one. That's my
Yeah,
number one.
that's
Number
your number
two,
one. Yeah, what's your old
yeah,
standby? Your old
yeah, my old
faithful.
standby, which hasn't gotten much better either. We talk about energy and tech and manufacturing and the implications these all have and why we stress about that. And these are all reasonable things to stress about. We hardly ever talk about food. The agricultural supply chain is by far the most sensitive to change, because any decision that a producer is making today impacts the food production that happens several years from now. And they need stability in the entire supply chain between now and then to make all the crops grow and the animals grow and raised and everything else. Most countries in the world, all but about a dozen, are dependent upon the outside world for 80% of their supply chain steps that are necessary to grow their own food. as on top of countries like, say, in the Middle East that import the majority of their own food. So if globalization breaks, the ability of the world to produce calories drops by somewhere between 30 and 60%.
How
That starves
rapidly
a
do you,
billion people to death minimum.
how rapidly do you think that occurs?
One harvest. We
Damn.
have 6 weeks of stocks on a global basis for food. We have less than that for the inputs. So when it breaks, it's quick.
Thinking about China, do you have, not that they're the most forthcoming with their information or their true thoughts on how things are going, do you have
Their
any
data's
insight?
hilarious.
Do you have any insight? They have to recognize their own population issue, right? Like you would assume that they're kind of taking a look at this. Are you getting any indication that they are in any way, shape, or form trying to solve that? Even though you've already talked about they may be past that
In
tipping
bits
point.
and pieces, I mean, it's okay. So it's a statistical issue. Whenever you've got a dictatorial government, statistics are one of the things that fall by the wayside because if you present the dear leader with data he doesn't like, he tends to either shoot the messenger or shoot the people produce the data. And if he does
Or
that
both.
enough
Don't
times,
forget both.
yeah, or both, yeah, they can be thorough. You do that enough times, and the bureaucracy stops collecting the data. And so China doesn't have birth rate data or death rate data or bond market data or dissertation data or local political biographies, anything that they think Xi might not like to hear, they just stopped collecting. So the picture's a little weird. Now, a few years ago, they had a bit of an issue. So there's three things that are going on with the statistics that they've only recently started to wrap their minds around. Number one, there are certain places, times, events in your life where the government knows you exist. Now, here, that's every fresh school year, every immunization, every year that you pay your taxes, get your driver's license. Lots of points in a first world country where that
Mhm.
happens. It's one of the reasons why our government data tends to be pretty good. In China, the first point was when you get immunized as a child, because most Chinese until recently were not born in hospitals.
Hmm.
So what they discovered was that the doctors were lying about the number of immunizations they gave in order to get paid more. The second time is when you enter primary school. Well, local governments get subsidies from the federal government based on the number of people they have, and that was the primary metric. So they inflated the numbers of school enrollees to get more money. And then third, if you remember back to Tiananmen, the Chinese kind of collectively made the decision that we need to move to a white collar economy because we're going to rule the world. So they started universities, which meant that the first time you paid taxes was no longer 17, 18, 19. It was 22, 23, 24.
Hmm.
Well, you fast forward 22 years later, and all of these people that the doctors and the local governments were reporting that existed in the system didn't pay taxes. But that was during COVID. It took till the end of COVID in 2023 for the Chinese government to realize, where are our people? And then they realized that they had 25 years of bad data.
Oof.
Well, that's a lot of people age 25 and under that just didn't happen, never did. And they're now only today starting to come to grips with that after Xi gutted the bureaucracy. So yeah, there's no coming back from this.
What do you estimate their behavior is going to look like as this decline becomes something that they can no longer, you can only put makeup on a pig for so long.
Yeah. Well, this isn't Russia. Russia has the option of actually invading countries and conquering them in order to solve some of its strategic problems. That's a big part of what the Ukraine war is about. But there's no place that Xi can send the army or the navy that can achieve anything because they're so trade dependent. They want to be an autarkic empire. They want to be what Trump wants the United States to be, but they don't have the population or the geography to make that happen. So it's really a question of what Xi decides he wants to do as the system fails. And since he has such bad information, guessing what that is going to be is a bit of a stretch. We have had a number of countries in human history that have collapsed for similar reasons, governments just being so out of touch, but we've never had one that has collapsed because there just weren't people anymore. You put
Yeah.
those two things together on top of globalization, This is going to get ugly, but it's certainly going to be uglier at home. China doesn't have the ability to reach out and touch people like a lot of previous world powers have had. They've got a big navy, but it just doesn't have range. The problem for us, for everyone, is that we don't have enough time to build out the industrial plant that's necessary to make the transition smooth. Xi has denied us that. Trump has denied us that. And so we're going to have massive product shortages in almost every category for a long time. Americans aren't used to that. Last time we had that was 1943.
Yeah, I would agree with you. The modern American is used to, in every store that you go into, every shelf is full at all times with convenience and choice in front of you, abounding.
And in a deglobalized world, that is not what it's going to look like. And in the transition to our post-deglobalized system, it's certainly not going to.
Do you think that our government structure and system is beyond repair? Do you think it's just
No, we've been through, I mean, don't get me wrong, I am not a fan of what we're doing right now, but we've been through things like this before. We have a first past the post single member district system, which is a fancy way of saying you vote for one person who represents a very specific geography and group of voters, and then that person represents that group of people in that space. We don't have a party list where we vote for a party or an idea across the country. You're voting for one guy in one place. And that means that our parties tend to be very big tent parties because you want to get one more vote than whoever comes in second place on every single district. So they tend to be broad, moderate parties. But every generation or so, we have changes in technology or demography or structure, culture, and the alliances that make up the parties break down and they reform. This is the 6th time we've done this. And if you look back throughout American history, most of the times we've done this have been times of extreme economic change. We've had the Depression and World War II. We've had a Reconstruction. We've had the initial phase of industrialization in the Northeast that goes back to the early 1820s. And every time we go through this, everything falls apart and then everything comes back together. We just have the unfortunate moment right now that is happening while the global structure is breaking and while we have a president who seems incapable of absorbing the reality around him to make policy. So it's hurting more than it needs to, but we'll get through it. We'll get through this again.
I'm Katarina Schultz. I'm a relentless investigative journalist who spent the last few years embedded in the heart of chaos of the world's most dangerous drug war.
Here's a dead body.
You might have heard my reporting on borderland narcosis. Now, I'm taking you to the front lines. I've built trust on both sides, with traffickers, law enforcement, and the very people trapped in between. I'm taking you into the heart of Mexico's cartel war with fast, raw updates from the heart of the borderlands. Subscribe now to Borderland Dispatches with me, Katarina Schultz. And don't miss my regular appearances on Borderland Narcosis with Vince Rocco Vargas on YouTube at This Is Ironclad or wherever you get your podcasts.
Again, I'm not an expert. You know, you brought up the danger.
You keep saying that, and then you ask really good questions.
Well, I'm curious. I mean, I'm a curious person, but I'm not an expert in anything. I mean, there's a couple things where I might have flirted with being an expert. None of them are germane to this conversation. Like, I love skydiving. I can tell you that gravity works on all the continents, and that's about it. And you need a parachute if you want to skydive more than once. One time, go ahead. You don't need a parachute 2 times.
Knock yourself out. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. But again, it's like, well, that doesn't really help me with world economics. I guess I've seen the world from a few thousand feet up. But, you know, you brought up the smartest man in the room being the most dangerous person. And the worst leaders that I ever worked for, specifically in the military, were always the ones who thought they had every answer. They would flatten the chain of command. They would not solicit for input and feedback unless they knew that they were going to get input and feedback that aligned with how they felt, because they staffed their staff with those people. And what sucks is the vast majority, if not everybody listening to this, they can either agree with or disagree with how we feel about our current political climate, but they can't do anything about it. You know, they can vote when it's their time to do their civic duty and vote, but they'll hear about the decline of globalization and things are going to get difficult. And I guess the question I'm getting to or the issue that I think is that a lot of people are struggling with is that they feel like that sense of I can't do anything, so I'm not going to pay attention to anything,
Yeah.
which I think is super dangerous. That's analogous to the head going into the sand. What advice would you get to people reading the cards that you have in front of you, the experience, the knowledge, the education you have, what you see coming on the horizon? It's like, okay, cool. You don't want to run for politics. You don't want to get involved in that aspect. What can the average person do to actually prepare for what you think is coming?
The biggest hole in our educational system is technical skills. If we're going to double the size of the industrial plant, we need a lot of people who can weld and wire and do all the rest. So do something that's going to help your pocketbook and maybe do a little less white collar and a little bit more blue collar. The fastest way to earn six figures right now is blue collar work. There's plenty of data that supports that. If you want to get into politics, the power is not in the general election, it's at the primaries. And that is true whether you're Democrat, a Republican, a liberal, a conservative, an independent, anything. We will probably 5 to 10 years from now have two different parties. MAGA isn't working and the Democrats died the last cycle. What those look like, I don't know, but it starts at the primary level to figure it out, just like we did it the last 5 times. And then third, of all of those transitions that we have been through, only in one did the government lead the way out. That was the New Deal in the aftermath of the Great Depression when we industrialized. The idea that the government is the solution here is a bit of would be an historical anomaly if it happened. This will happen because we fix it. You don't need a master plan for how to remake the country. You just need the ability to make product.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up the trades. So my youngest daughter, and I've never asked my children, actually, it goes beyond my daughter. I've never asked my children one of the worst questions that I think people ask children, and I don't think they do it maliciously, is, what do you want to be when you grow up? Which I don't think is a bad question.
I'm still figuring that out.
As am I, and that's why I don't ask it. And I actually think it's a really common question for adults to ask kids who don't have kids, because they're like, shit, I know I need to communicate with this little thing, but I don't know what to ask. But this seems like it. And what are the answer? Astronaut, firefighter, cop, military. Well, guess what? There's not that many people who do that, so opinions change over time. I ask my kids, what are you interested in? That's the only question I've ever really asked them, and then I've helped them pursue it. My daughter is getting ready to start trade school for welding. She's an apprentice welder right now. And you want to talk about, you mentioned the fastest way to earn 6 figures. I was having this conversation with her yesterday. She already has companies reaching out to her through the trade school and the person that she is apprenticing with, offering her jobs that start at near $80 an hour if she can make it through that course. And I think back to the first job I had where my father paid me $1.50 an hour, and I'm pretty fucking pissed.
Supply and demand. We don't have enough. One of the things that the baby boomers got wrong, and there's a list, is they convinced their kids that everyone who wanted to be anyone had to go to university. And, I'm white collar educated. I've done very well with that myself personally, but it changed the structure of the labor force. And that's not the labor force we're going to need 5 years from now.
I keep telling her, stick with this and you are going to be able to, no pun intended, write your own check for wherever you want to go. Do you want to live by an ocean city, specialize in maritime? You want to maybe avoid the oil fields. I don't know how great that would be for an attractive young woman. Maybe, stay a little bit more civilized. Nothing
Most
negative.
Of the welding in the oil field is on the pipelines. They're not actually hanging out in the man camps, but I see your point.
Nothing against those things, but it's like, it's my daughter and I'll kill all of you if you guys touch her. So, let's just remember that. If they could drop you into the Oval Office and you had a week.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Well,
why would you do that?
It can be remote. You get to go home. So it'll be a Zoom or a Riverside like this.
Sure.
And here's the caveat though. They had to listen and do what you told them to do. What would you unwind or what levers would you throw to maybe reorient the direction you see the country going?
I'm going to assume that I'm only going to be there for a very short period of time. So I'm going to keep
5 business days. But the things that you suggest, I don't know, they have to stay in effect for 2 years minimum.
Yeah, let's start with the baseline. Unless we get the processing industrial expansion done first and right, none of the rest of this matters. So that means smelting our own aluminum. That means forging our own steel. That means taking all of the base mine products and being able to turn them into intermediate products that then the rest of the economy can use. Because if we can't do that, we can't try at anything else. And then the second piece, which is the other side of that coin, is electricity. AI uses a lot of power, but not nearly as much as manufacturing when you actually have to physically move and weld things. We need to expand the grid by at least half. And that means changing the way that we regulate the electricity system so it's not just city and state. We actually need to build proper grids and allow some parts of the country to export electricity at volume to other parts of the country. If we can do those two things, laissez-faire capitalist system will probably take care of the rest, but we have to get that right before we can really begin.
Not a lot of people talk about the power system either.
It's not very sexy.
Yeah, I've hosted a few guests who talked about the grid or the aging nature of the infrastructure, and countless, well, not countless, but quite a few California fires that have begun, because they're going above ground as opposed to underground, and the cost associated with it. I mean, that's a pack a lunch affair in and of itself, just rebuilding the grid.
I don't think rebuilding is the right term. If we were having this conversation 3 years ago, it would have, but now we just need more. We need more of everything everywhere. And so you want solar panels, great. Make sure it's sunny before you put them up. You want wind turbines, great. Make sure it's windy where you're putting those up.
Yeah.
But we're not going to retire anything. Any environmental goals that people might have had a few years ago, those are in the wind now. We just need more and more and more and more electrons. And unless we get them, none of the rest of this is going to happen.
What is there anything that you can point towards that makes you hopeful about the future of the U.S.?
We're still here. We've
currently, at least right now.
We've done the economic transformation before. We can do it again. We've done the political transformation before. We can do it again. We are the healthiest demographic structure in the first world. So if any country can pull this off, it is us. And everything that we need to know, we need to do, we already know how to do. We're not reinventing the wheel here. That doesn't take away from the scope of the challenge. There's a lot of work ahead of us, but none of this is a mystery. The only challenge is time.
What would you, and what obviously won't hold you to this, as a guesstimate, if you will, the true breakdown of globalization. If you had to throw a dart at multiple calendars up on the wall with years on it.
We had some interesting moments in the last few weeks where it felt like it was right now.
Really?
When we had 145% trade tariff on China. That's not a trade war, that's an embargo. And if that had stuck, we would have seen a breakdown in the Chinese system in under 3 or 4 years, and a breakdown of the American economic structure in a similar time frame, just because of a lack of product and inputs. Right now, everything is in flux. We have a different problem now. The goalposts keep changing. Remember, 133 trade policies.
Yeah.
I just talked myself into a circle there. Sorry.
Well, no, it's okay. You're talking about the 145%. I honestly, again, as somebody who doesn't understand at a deep level, I couldn't tell if he was serious or if he was just trying to be a bully, for a lack of a better term. And there's a time and place. There's a time and place to be that aggressive and be like, hey, this is our fucking line in the sand. But also it flipped so quickly. I'm like, were you actually serious, or were you picking a number that was so ridiculous that they had no choice but to bend? But if they hadn't been, like you said, it would have been the decline of the system.
Well, they didn't bend. The trade deals that we have so far were just an agreement to talk more. Nothing's really changed on the ground. Until we have a series of policies that actually encourage reindustrialization here instead of penalize it, this is where we are.
Yeah, I have some friends who, a buddy of mine who owns a company called Montana Knife Company. He is politically, I'd say he aligns pretty well to the right. It's a relatively, people think Montana is
Montana and knife in the name of the company. That does not surprise me.
Yeah, but honestly though, his Montana is like, I grew up born and raised in California, which people think is a sea of only blue. I'm like, no, you should probably go look at the most recent voting maps. It's a little bit of blue and a lot of red interior. Montana is a lot of red with a little bit of blue in some of the major cities, specifically the college towns, which abut where his business is in Frenchtown. It's just outside of Missoula, which is a pocket of blue. So nothing is that binary. He was very critical, probably to the detriment of his personal following and potentially his business, talking about Trump's latest tariffs on steel and aluminum. It's like, these are the products that I am trying to bring more jobs into the U.S. to create these knives with. And now you know what I mean? It's just like we are cutting off our nose to spite our face. And I think at least more people are starting to pay attention to those things. I mean, maybe for him, that was obviously very, very right in his face, because he's probably going to instantly notice the difference in cost in that. And those are the goods that he needs to create his services. But I do see more people paying attention.
The U.S. is a value-added economy. And if you want to be a value-added economy, you need to buy the chunks that are not value-added and then add value. Steel is one of those products.
Yeah, he was saying that the government had the chance to largely save the steel industry a few years ago, but instead the last remaining, and I'm probably horribly paraphrasing this, but the last remaining steel industry was purchased by a European company instead.
Yeah, I think that's an oversimplification.
This is me fucking up what he was saying. So
sure. Well, it's just the technology is evolving. You've got blast furnaces where they use the old style coal and the big jug and pour the molten stuff, and that's how you make virgin steel. And you have something called an arc furnace where they basically just electrocute the shit out of it until it melts. And since the United States has the shale revolution and has good solar and has good wind, we have the cheapest electricity in the world. So we've been bit by bit moving away from the old forging style to the new electric arc style. It works better recycling steel than making virgin steel, but that line is getting more and more blurred. So saying that our old forging steel is something we need to save, that might have been true 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. Now it's not clear. The technology is getting so interesting that you can have these mom and pop steel foundries that just take old bumpers and frames and I-beams and everything, and just turn them into usable steel. And the quality of what comes out of the other side is getting better and better and better every time. So if we keep on this path, within 10 years, we can recycle everybody's steel cheaper than they can make the fresh stuff.
That'd be pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of your time, and I deeply appreciate your insight. What do you want to leave the listeners and viewers with? I mean, obviously, this episode is going to be titled "We Are Fucked." So, with an asterisk, for a little while, but we're going to be okay. It's a tagline.
Yeah, it's going to be a rough ride for a while, not just for the world, but for the United States. Now, the United States walks away from this. Our agricultural system is good. Our infrastructure is great. Our educational system is top notch. We have no problem with food supply. So all of the basics of modern society and post-industrialism, those are not going away. But we need to take a step back and build out an industrial process now that we thought we had evolved beyond. And if we're going to do that ourselves, just for us, that's 2 steps back. So the smart play is to bring as many countries as we can with us for this. And this is something where you would have thought that Donald Trump already did the hard work. He renegotiated NAFTA in his first term. He got a trade deal with Korea and with Japan. They started one with the United Kingdom. So most of the countries we would have needed to do this were already kind of part of a friends and family program. If he can get back to that mindset, this gets a lot easier.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks you again for listening to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. I'll see everybody next week with an all-new guest and an all-new topic. See you then.